once again to this screen recording. In this tutorial, what I want to have a look at is deep-etching or cutting out a face to be used in an ID. And this can be used for a multitude of things, and once you get the techniques for using a face in particular, it can be applied to many other things. So we're going to be using masking techniques. We're also going to be using the channels technique for be able to select and hiding the background. And before we jump into the actual techniques themselves, it is important that we get a good quality source image. Photoshop relies on good quality and good contrast and high resolution to be able to run its algorithms. So if you've got a low quality image or blurry or pixelated, it is going to struggle and you're going to make your life a lot more difficult than it needs to be. So let's have a look at some of the key aspects that we want to look at for doing a cutout for a portrait. So we do want to make sure the whole face is in the frame. Top of the head isn't cut off. If that is the case and you do need the top of the head, you're going to have to do some serious repair work to get that back. Make sure your image is not overexposed, so we haven't got any highly saturated or intense lights hitting our object and just obliterating our details. It's usually better if your character is not wearing glasses. If you do wish to remove the glasses in Photoshop, that can cause you a little bit of extra work. So if you really do want the character to have glasses, I'd recommend getting at least two images, one with, one without. So keep that in mind. Eyes open looking forwards makes sense. There's a lot more we can do with that than if the eyes were closed and trying to repair that. Good detail, good resolution. It goes without saying, if you do not have good detail and good resolution, you are setting yourself up for failure. Front facing and neutral face expression, this is just typical for things like IDs. They don't really want you pulling a funny face or have your face off to the side or anything like that. No overbearing shadows. This goes hand in hand with not having overexposure. The image we want in color. It's easier to get a color image and turn it to black and white. It is very hard to get a black and white image and turn it to color. So better start with color. Hair not covering the face. If we are going to do any manipulation and Photoshop trickery, we do want to have as much detail of the face available. Otherwise we're going to have to do some really hard work trying to remove things like hair. So same thing goes with glasses. Good contrasting simple background showing hair and face, no drop shadows. This is very important, making sure that you've got a good clean background with a good contrast to the colors of our character and hair. So let's have a look at some of the don'ts. So let's jump into here. Here are some of the don'ts, and this kind of reiterates what I've just said. No overly complex backgrounds. We want a nice simple background. Photoshop's really going to struggle selecting the difference between the hair and the background in this image. Background that will conflict with the values of the hair or face. So this area here, which is very dark, it's going to struggle trying to decide which is the area we actually want to select. So try and avoid that. We want a good contrast. Shadows on the background. This would be a fantastic photo if it weren't for this drop shadow here. So this character is a little bit closer to their background, and that is going to cause a little bit of grief there as Photoshop struggles to differentiate between the dark and light areas. So step your photos away from the background a bit. Low resolution or blurred. Enough said. Photoshop does not like dealing with blurry images. Remember, Photoshop is pixel based, so when it gets down to that little nitty gritty, it's looking at the difference between one square and the next, and if it doesn't have that information, it's going to get confused. Overexposed lighting. Yep, fair enough. We want to see some detail. Hair, hats, glasses, anything covering the face, we want to see that face. And black and white, as I said before, just looks pretty, but we want to start with color and try not to pull any weird faces for your image. So I've created a quick flowchart showing where we want to go with this. I'm going to show you two techniques. One is the mask mode technique and the other is the channels technique. The first one, we actually start off with two options to take this. One is to select the area you want to mask and then apply the mask. The other one is to just apply a mask and then use the mask mode to mask off unwanted areas. Once you've done that, you want to test using the appropriate view modes based on the image. So we want to make sure that it looks good with potentially a black background, a white background, a color background, and also anything that's going to be in contrast, so we can make sure that we've done an accurate mask. And you also use the edge refine tool and brush to enhance. Check and repair any unwanted semi-transparent areas in black and white view mode. So we do want to make sure we don't have any, off to the side masking issues that might crop up later that we might not see in some of the other view modes. Once that's done, apply the mask adjustment and refine using the dodge and burn tool techniques. So I'm going to be running through that step by step. The next one, I'm going to quickly go through the steps of this, and we are going to go through that step by step in the video as well. Channels technique. We need to make sure we duplicate the layer before we start working on the channels technique, because it is destructive and it will destroy any layer that you are currently on. We need to open up the channels panel and select either red, green or blue channel with the most contrast and the background. I do really want to stipulate that channel technique relies on you having a good strong contrast to your character as far as color and also preferentially value, so light to dark. Adjust the levels of that channel that you've selected and the background, so you get that the harshest contrast between black and white. We want to remove all grayscales, because in mask land everything that's white is visible, everything black is invisible, and we want to make sure we don't get any semi-transparent unless we absolutely decide we need to. Use the brush tool to fill in bulk shapes with black or white. So we do want to kick out any semi-transparent areas, so it needs to be either black or white. We're going to use just a simple brush for that. Use the dodge and burn tool to further increase contrast as required, and then select the white areas in the image using Control or Command if you're on Mac, and click in the channel's thumbnail window. You may need to inverse the selection, so if your background is white and you actually want your subject, you will need to reverse that selection. If your subject is white and your background is black, once this is done, then that is probably what you're after. So Shift Control I inverse, you may need to apply that. Turn back the RGB, the red, green, blue channels again, and this will actually show you that this image that you have selected is destroyed. It'll increase whichever color you've been playing around. Delete the layer you've just adjusted while keeping the selection activated. So when we selected that white area or dark area, you want to keep that selected and then go back to the original layer, not the duplicate, and then press the mask button, and this will mask out our image. Finally, we use the dodge and burn tools to further increase the contrast as required, and or use the mask mode and any other masking techniques above. So there's the basics. I'm going to jump in and show you guys the image that I'm going to be working on. So here it is here. Now this is not the absolute perfect image. This is actually a screenshot from a film. It's a reasonable quality. I can check this. I can go image size, and I can see it's 2560 by 1600 pixels, which is reasonable. The higher the resolution, unless it's extreme, is going to be preferential, but the main thing that I'm really interested is in seeing the contrast in background, particularly to Jeff Bridges' hair and his shirt here. So the shirt's usually easier, but these little strands of hair are going to be really tricky to cut out. So I'm looking for that strong contrast, and ideally when you are taking your photos, that's what you want to look like. If you've got someone with light hair, you want a dark background. If you've got someone with dark hair, you want a light background. And we're going to see how well we can do to actually cut and deep-etch this image. Okay, first things first, we are going to use the masking technique. And what I usually suggest is, if you have opened this up directly as a document, your photo will become your background layer. Now I'm going to duplicate this. There's a number way of doing this. One is to drag this to the plus sign in your layers panel, and that will create a duplicate, or you could right click and go to duplicate layer, or you can also go to layer, new, and duplicate, layer, duplicate layer, and that will do it as well. But for me, I just like dragging into the plus sign. It asks less questions. Now we do need to hide the background layer, and the simple reason for that is if I do something drastic like grab an eraser tool and start erasing stuff, you won't see it. And the reason for that is that our background layer is identical because we've duplicated it, and it will mess up our view. So I'm actually going to delete that erase or step back, and I'm going to turn off that background. Make sure I'm selected back onto this layer. Okay, so if you do remember the flowchart, there are two options here. One option is to select first, then mask, or the other way is to mask and then use some of the built-in selection tools. So I'm going to go with the first one, where I'm going to use the selection tools. Now I do recommend you get used to using the basic selection tools, including lasso, marquee tools, and these ones here, which is object selection, quick selection, and the wand tool. Now in this case, I actually do think the quick selection is probably the most powerful for this, and essentially what you do is you start in your subject and you drag outwards, and do it incrementally, and that will usually do a reasonable job of selecting our object or our character. If you do go a little bit far out, like I have there, I'm going to actually step back a little. I just want it popping out a little bit. You can subtract from that by pressing Alt or going to the negative button here and dragging back. So that works pretty well. The other way of doing that, I'm going to hit Command or Control D to deselect, is to actually select the background first in this case. So I'm going to do selecting the background first, and as you can see, it's not going to be a very accurate mask. Now if I press the mask button, which is this rectangle with a circle, if you hover over it, it says add layer mask. You'll see that because I had the background selected as the primary, it has made anything outside of that selection invisible, in this case my character. So I'm going to undo that, Command Z, and I'm going to inverse that selection. So select, inverse, or Shift Control or Shift Command I for inverse. It is a very, very useful tool to have, because sometimes selecting the opposite of what you want and then reversing that selection is more effective than selecting the thing you want and just going with that. So inversing selection is very powerful. So I'm going to hit that, and now you should see that's changed slightly. We don't have the perimeter marching ants, and now I can add my mask to that. Now in this particular mode, you can see it's very jagged, and one of the things I usually suggest is, if you really want to see some mistakes straight on, is create a blank layer below. And I'm going to go to my paint bucket tool. Shortcut is G. Make sure you're on the paint bucket, not the gradient tool. So you can press Shift G, and I'm going to select a nice contrasting color. I'm going to go something like quite a saturated blue and drop that in there in the layer below. So a full solid color, and as you can see, it looks pretty bad as far as a cutout goes. The edges here are quite good on the shirt, but the rest of this hair is not going to be looking great. So this is where we actually go into our mask mode, and to enter our mask mode we simply double click on the mask. Now it is important to note that the mask is separate from the layer. They are linked, so if I move my object, let's make sure I'm selected on the correct layer. If I move my object, the mask will move with it unless I unlink, in which case I can select the layer, and as you can see I can move that around. The mask will stay put, or I can select on the mask and my layer will stay put. So it is important to know that that is a different entity and that you are selected on the correct thing. Anyway, let's jump back to it. I'm going to double click on the mask here, and this will enter into mask mode. Occasionally that won't work, in which case simply right click on this and go into select and mask, and that will open up our new panel. Now in this panel there are a bunch of tools here as well, and before I delve into that, I do want to show the other option of getting into here as well. So I'm actually going to cancel out of that. I'm going to right click on my mask and I'm going to delete it, delete layer mask. So I did this in a way to show you that you can select an area and then mask it, and you can also paint on it and do whatever else you want, but I'm going to do all my selection inside mask mode itself. So with my layer selected, I'm going to go down to the mask button. Now I have nothing selected at the moment, but I'm going to press add layer mask. There's my mask there. Remember, in mask world, everything that is completely white is visible, in which case this entire image is still visible. Anything black is invisible, and anywhere in between is going to be semi-transparent. So at the moment this is completely white, my image is completely visible, and I'm going to double click or open that layer mask mode, and here we are. On the left we have some very basic tools. We have a quick selection tool, and if you hover over these will come up. We've got an edge refine tool, a brush tool, and we've also got an object selection tool and a lasso tool. We've also got our move tools, our hand tool and our zoom tool. These will work the same as in your regular interface, spacebar to move and command plus or minus to zoom in and out. Over here in our properties, we have some very important things to look at. View mode. Now view mode is actually going to allow us to look at our image in a bunch of different ways to make sure that we can actually get a good idea of where our mask is ending or where it isn't, and be able to make adjustments, because sometimes it can be tricky to understand what you've actually hidden and what you haven't. So let's first off start by adding a mask to this. Now at the moment there is a mask applied, but there is nothing hidden on it. So my very first tool, which is the quick selection tool, which is again one of the strongest ones, by default is set to add, which means that I am going to be showing areas, but everything is already showing, so instead I'm going to switch to minus or subtract. The shortcut toggle for this is pressing the Alt key. So as I press Alt, you'll see that will automatically adjust to a negative. Please note you can also adjust the size of the brush, so that might be a really good one to look at, and you can also do that by pressing command the square brackets on your keyboard, and that will do that automatically. Sample layers, and also you've got a button for select subject. So I'm actually going to use the negative of this at the moment to give you a quick idea of that. I want to subtract the areas that I don't want, and you may be able to see this just sliding through here. Now I've been playing with the defaults for this, so I'm actually going to go over to my view mode and click on there, and you can see that I currently have this on black. Now that's actually not helping me much because the background is pretty black at the moment anyway. So let's have a look at some of the other options. I think by default it's around 53% or there. So the very first one is onion skinning, and what that allows me to do is start seeing through my top layer into the layers behind that. And if we remember before, I created that stark blue background, and that's what we're seeing. So if I lower the transparency to 0, I'm going to see my layer, and as I increase that, we're actually going to see what's being hidden by being able to see the background, in which case it's the blue layer. So I can toggle this off, and the advantage of this is I can actually lower this and be able to see any areas that I might have missed that I've cut out. So it's actually very, very useful. Marching ants gives us a really broad idea of where everything's by using the marching ants. Overlay is actually going to allow us to add a color, and I'm going to go to the default, which is actually red, to be able to see where our layer is and add this little block color to it. So it's going to give us a good contrast. Then we've got on black, which is going to give us a black background. On white, going to give us a white background, and then black and white, which is actually a really important one, and then finally on layers. So it's going to have the layers below. At this point, the most useful one for me is actually going to be onion skinning, because I'm going to be able to see all these little strands of hair that I'm missing out. So I'm going to adjust that until I can get a really good view of that. And once again, press Alt to subtract, and I'm going to start dragging that in around the hair, dragging that in, dragging that in. If it goes too far, remember you can take your finger off Alt and add, and we can start going through like that. So that's actually quite useful. I'm going to go really destructive. I'm going to bring this back to normal, and I'm simply going to hit select subject. Now this sometimes will work really well. It's asking me if I want to discard the current selection, which I absolutely do, and bang, it might actually do a reasonable job of that. So I'm actually going to step back from that. There are some other options in here. We have a simple brush tool. Once again, it is currently set to add, so if I press Alt or set to negative, I can actually start subtracting that. And if I bring this transparency up, you will actually see that that's how I've cut out the image. And you can have some options for your brushes as far as size and hardness and spacing and stuff like that. We do have this one here, which is fairly new. This is object selection tool. This is going to look quite similar to select subject anyway. So I just click and drag over the subject that I want, give it a few seconds, and hopefully it'll work. Alright, let's just try it on a small area. I'm going to see if how it works on his goatee and stuff. Oh, rookie mistake, I actually forgot to press Alt. So I'm actually making a selection, and that's reversing it right there, and it's actually done a reasonable job of just selecting that there, so like so. So all of these things have a negative. Lasso tool as well, that does nothing, but reverse alt will allow me to do that. So each of these has its own specific thing that we can use. I'm going to be really lazy and just press select subject. Give it a few seconds, and there it goes there. Alright, I'm going to lower my transparency once again because I want to see those little strands of hair, and at this point it's still not a great mask. I'm going to go to this next tool here. This is one of my favorite tools in Photoshop. This is the Edge Refine tool, R. Again, it's got a positive and a negative, so Alt will apply the negative. It's also got some brush options as well, and sample layers should you need it. I'm going to get my brush size up a little bit, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to brush over just the edges of his hair where I want to actually see those little strands of hair. Let's see how this works. And it's not doing a terrible job. It's trying to add those little strands where I want them, and it does require that there is a mask applied. So if there is no mask in the area, it's not really going to do much. If I click over here on the left, it's just going to go, well, there's no mask there. So it really does, as the name suggests, refine the edge. And if you do a good enough job, you can build this up. Now it will get confused. Remember, Photoshop doesn't know exactly what the subject is that you're after. It's just trying to guess in a way. It's looking for those contrasts and trying to decide what those are. Now if it does go too far and you want to bring something back, remember, press Alt, and that will reverse, and then you can try rebuild as well. So sometimes a little back and forth will help you out with that. Once you've got a reasonable result for that, do check your view mode. So pop up your transparencies and also try some of the other ones like overlay, and you can see we've got a few issues still popping here, and this might need a bit of back and forth with Alt and plus. And also try on black, and otherwise what I usually also recommend is try black and white. What this is going to do is going to look for any grey areas. Remember, grey is essentially going to be semi-transparent. We either want to have white or we want to have black. So it's a great one to check, and there could be little stray areas that you may need to look for in that, in which case you could potentially paint them out using the brush tool, which comes in either black or white. Alright, let's hit that back to one of the other ones that I can actually see. Below this we actually have some other options. We've got some edge detection radius, we've also got some other ones, global refinements, including one called shift edge, which it can actually allow you to shift the edge of something in or out, and also a feather option. Now while these are kind of useful to some degree, I usually find that they don't do a hell of a lot unless you're after something very specialized. So shift edge can sometimes be useful, but you know, have a play around, see what you go with. Once you think you've actually got a reasonable selection, hit OK, and that will apply that mask, and you can see that there is our new shape of that mask there. Now one of the things I want to show you is, if we look at our flowchart, we've checked the we've used the edge refine tool, we've checked the black and white mode, and we've applied the mask, and now we're going to use some dodge and burn techniques. So now that we actually have the mask here, we can do a little bit further refinement of this, and usually what I suggest for doing this is using this tool here. Shortcut is O, and it's the dodge and burn tool. There is a sponge tool here, but it actually doesn't have much use because it is a sponge tool basically increases or decreases saturation, and the masks themselves work in black and white, so there is no saturation. But dodge allows you to lighten an area, and burn allows you to darken an area. And the cool thing with these is that you can actually choose the range that they affect. So in the dodge tool, to lighten, I can choose to have it lighten the highlighted areas, the mid-tone areas, or the shadow areas. So for most of it, what I usually want to do is I want to make areas that are maybe close to being light but are a little bit dark, I can use that and drag that over, and that's going to really bring those back. So up here at the top of his hair, I can look at that and I can say this area here that's semi-transparent, I actually want that more visible, and because I'm making it brighter and getting it close to white, that is actually going to help it out and define it a little bit more. In contrast to that, if I shift to the burn tool and I select the range of shadows, it is going to darken areas that are already slightly dark as well. So this is actually going to sharpen up some of the areas. Let's actually zoom in and have a closer look at that. So some of these little hair follicles here, as I click on that with the burn tool, you can see it's going to start pushing those back in. And some of these areas which it's not sure whether it's dark or light, I can say I want this area to be darker, thereby making it more invisible, or switching to the dodge tool again, I want to make these hair follicles lighter and redefine them. So you can jump back and forwards between those and really decide how you want to refine them. Now there are a few other problems with this as well. I haven't obviously done a really great job because this is a demonstration, but one of the other big problems is that we have got a big bleed coming through, which is areas that don't quite have the color attached to it. So we've got some semi-transparent areas, and I could go through and use that dodge and burn tool to really switch between. I'm using Shift O to switch between these and really define those little areas there, and that's doing a pretty good job. But I'm still going to get this little area where it could be if there's a green screen or a blue screen. This is a fake blue screen, by the way. You can get some lights popping through from that background and affecting the color of their hair, and the last thing you want is someone who doesn't have green hair to have green hair, and it's going to look really badly cut out. So here's a technique using clipping masks. So clipping masks, all they do is they attach themselves to the layer below. So I've just created a new layer by pressing the plus sign down here. There's my new layer, and let's call this hair change color, just as an example. Now I'm going to show you just really quickly. I'm going to hit B for brush. I'm going to get myself a nice big, reasonably big brush, and right click or go to your brush tool over here, and I'm going to select soft round. I want this to be slightly blurry, and I'm going to select a hair color. So I'm going to press Alt and I'm going to go around until I find a reasonable hair color, and I'm just going to paint around around the edges of this hair. Now I'm going to do this incorrectly a little bit, just so, but this is, again, it's a demo. So this is hanging way outside of Jeff's face here, but if I right click on this layer now and go to create clipping mask, it will actually attach itself to the exact form of the layer below, in which case it's got a mask on it. So as you can see, that's covering perfectly to all those strands of hair, and as I paint over that, it is going to apply it exactly to those hair and not out. So that mask is now affecting that layer, which is just a block color. Now I'm actually going to delete the contents of that, in fact delete the whole layer again and redo it. So new layer, right click, clipping mask. I'm going to lower my opacity of my brush. I want to do this gradually. I'm going to drop it down, let's say about 40%, and I've still got the same color selected, but you can adjust your color as you go to different areas, and as I brush over that, you can see it's going to start painting in those hairs as required. And because it's a nice soft brush and it's not overly opaque, I should be able to see that working fairly well. Now in all, that's not great because it's kind of painting over the details of the hair. So what you can do now is go to the blend mode, which is currently set to normal, and scrub through this and see if you can find one that's going to work. Now depending on your subject, multiply is usually a winner, but in this case we're going for sort of lighter hair. So lighten's not too bad, screen's interesting, and as we go down we might just find one that's going to work. Now we might need to do this in separate layers as well, but let's see how we go. Hue, saturation, and lumen. luminosity. I think lighten was probably a little bit better, like so, and I might just lower the opacity a little bit, and we can see as I toggle that on and off, that might just help us out a little bit with our image. A few other little things that you might want to do as well is jump into your mask again on your layer, and there is a, over here is a blur tool. It's actually default. I've got mine on the smudge tool. Looks like a little teardrop here, and you can actually get that to blur out any images. So if you have got any sort of weird sections that you want to just sort of blur out a little bit, you can manually just run through that and add a little blur to it, which is sometimes what we're going to get on those little hair follicles and stuff like that. So that's our first technique, and don't forget, at any point you can always re-enter your mask mode and make adjustments as well. And further do that, you can manually go in and paint on this, so that involves painting either in the mask mode or directly. If you do get a really fine brush and you've got all the time in the world, you might be able to actually manually paint into this. Remember, black is going to make areas invisible, like so. I do have the opacity down, and if I switch to white, just pressing X, it will allow you to rebuild from that. So great thing about masks is they do not destroy your image, so at any point you can go disable layer mask, and there's our background again still. Or at some point, if you do want to apply it, you can right click on the mask and go apply layer mask, and that will now be permanent. That's, that's our background removed as is with any transparencies. So that's option number one, is using that mask mode. What I'm going to do now is actually show you a different option. I'm going to delete all those and I'm going to go right to the beginning, and this is using channels. And channels really does work well if you've got the correct photograph with a good background on it, and it gets a lot of detail if you know how to do it correctly. So first things first, I do need to make sure I do have a duplicate of my layer, because we are going to destroy it. And to destroy it, we're going to change the colors on it. So same thing again, new layer. In this case, I'm going to go to the channels panel. And if you are like me, you'll have the channels panel actually hidden next to the layers panel over here. If it's not there or you can't find it, go to your window and go to channels and bring that up, and it'll pop up here. And what we're going to see is the image is made up of RGB, red, green, blue, and that's what we're seeing. All of these are visible, all the channels are visible. Now we can actually click on individual channels. We can say, give us the values, the light to dark, of red, green, and blue. So all these are really quite significant, and what I'm actually looking for is the trouble spots, and the trouble spots are usually going to be the hair. That's going to be the tricky part, and I'm looking for the channel with the best contrast. It's going to show me the most detail of the hair and have that contrast between the background, and it's kind of a tricky one. They all work relatively well, but I do think, just as far as value for the face as well and the hair, it's kind of got more reddy than any other color. So I think that's actually got the most contrast as I'm looking at these individual strands of hair compared to the other ones, and only slightly, and also his face is popping a bit more. So it's about getting that contrast. It could be reversed. It could be that your figure is darker and your background is brighter, but you do want to make sure it's got a good contrast, which is one of the reasons why I selected this image. And once we've got that channel selected, we are going to make some further adjustments. I'm going to go to Image, Adjust, and Levels, or Command or Control L is the shortcut for that. But let's bring up the channels. This is our histogram. The histogram actually shows us over here on the left. This shows us the dark or pure black point. And we can see there's actually a big chunk of black point through there, and then it tapers down dramatically, and we've got nice little steady hair, and then we've got a nice little peak here. And over here on the right is pure white, which there actually really isn't much of. Now what we can do with that is we can actually start pushing in the pure black point, and what you'll see is some of these rafters and stuff in the background that are grey are going to get darker and darker. So I'm going to start pushing that in, and I've got to be really careful not to destroy my image, so do feel free to zoom in, because if I push it too far, you can see we're going to start killing it. So I really got to get really quite close with that. Now I'm going to go to my light point and start pushing that out. We can also play around with the midpoint, but let's keep playing around with this until we get something that I think is going to work. Kind of tricky. There's a few little parts where we're not going to get the detail back. Remember, we're just relying on these little pixel information. So as a really good example, this little hair strand here, I don't know if we're going to get that connected all the way through. I think we're just going to have to lose it at some point, and some of these here as well. So it is what it is. So I think that's about as close as we're going to get at this point. I'm going to hit OK for this. And what we need to do now is we actually need to go through and do some further refinement, and I want to make sure that my background is completely one color, in this case black, and my foreground is a completely other color, in which case white. And to do this I'm going to use a combination of brush tools and lassos and stuff like that. First things first, let's just do a basic brush tool. It's one of my favorites. B for brush. We've used it before. We need to make sure that we don't use a soft brush, and I'll show you exactly why for that. Let's undo that. Some weird stuff happening there. I'm going to get my opacity back up to 100, and if I do use a soft white brush, I'm going to hit D for default colors, X to switch over. You can see I'm going to get this little burnout. So I might think I'm going within the lines, and it's going to create this slight little halo effect or corona effect. So I'm going to make sure I'm on a hard round brush. If you do have a Wacom, fantastic, that might help you out, but I'm just using a mouse at the moment. I'm also going to use the shift key, and as I hit my finger on the shift key, it's going to allow me to draw some straight lines point to point. So I'm going to get fairly close to the edge without destroying it. I want to just get areas that I think need to be completely visible, and just keep away from those edges. We want to make sure we don't hit any areas that have detail that we don't want to lose or not to become completely visible. So that's kind of getting there. It's obviously not perfect, so this is actually where we're going to jump in and start using our dodge and burn tool. I'm going to switch over to black, and I'm also going to eat away some of this part here. And if you do want another trick as well, you can zoom in and use your poly lasso tool. You can also use a pen tool for this, but this will usually do the spot. And if you do have things that have an exact hard edge, or in this case a slightly curved edge, you can even get away with, and you could potentially select an area, brush, and then that will stop you from going over the lines in that case. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start using the dodge and burn tool. We've used this before. Shortcut is O, dodge is going to lighten. I've got that set to highlights, and let's zoom in. So this is mainly going to affect areas that already have some brightness to them, and less so dark areas. So if I brush over here in the black, nothing really happens. So this is why it works so well, because it's going to allow me to go right along the edge here and just pop these little areas which are sort of semi-grey areas, which means that they're going to be slightly transparent, and then really push them out to white. If it's going too extreme, do lower the exposure. It'll allow you to do it a little bit more gradually than not. And I'm going to try and ramp these ones up, which means I'll probably drop my exposure down just a little bit just to pop those up. Now I'm going to switch over to the burn tool, and you can toggle between these quite quickly, so just keep that in mind. And I've got this set to shadow, so I want to get areas that are already dark and make them darker. Occasionally midtones also works. If you're a little bit unsure of which one, do play around with it. And I'm going to push some of those areas that are maybe a little bit too, like up here we've got a few that are sort of being a little bit scallywaggy, and along the edge here I do want to darken those out. That's quite a harsh edge. And of course, I think we got most of that. Cool. Now there's a few little areas here that are missing. I'm going to quickly grab those with the brush again. Oops, wrong one. Remember, X is going to allow you to toggle between your default colors. So D for default to get your default colors, black and white, and X to switch back and forth. Pretty handy. It looks like there might be a little hole here, but we can always fix it later. So that's looking reasonably good, I think. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use that as my starting mask. So to select this, I'm going to go to the channel here, my channels panel, and this is the one I'm currently on, which is red. I'm going to press Control or Command if you're on a PC and click in the thumbnail window. So as I'm hovering over thumbnail, as I press Command or Control, a little rectangle will appear, and as I left click in that, that will now select anything that is white, and it will actually do a really good selection of it. You won't see it all in the marching ants, but it's done a pretty accurate selection of that. If it's reversed, depending on your image, if you happen to have your background as being white and your character as being black, then you may need to inverse select that. So you can do that by going to Select, Inverse, or Shift Control or Shift Command I for inverse. But in my case, this is exactly what I want, is the white area. Once that's done, I'm going to turn back on the RGB, and you can see this is what we've done by adjusting the contrasts. Is we played around with the red channel and we ramped it up to the point where the blues are more saturated and the reds are more saturated. Now I'm going to go back to my layers panel, and this one layer is pretty much destroyed, so I'm just going to hit backspace or delete. Let's make sure I'm clicked back on the RGB. Sorry, you can make sure you clicked back on it, otherwise you're just going to delete that channel. And I'm going to delete that entire layer. Actually, I can't just hit backspace, got to put it in the rubbish bin. And here's my background. This is where I started. I'm actually going to duplicate that because I like having a background. And I still have the marching ants going paramount, and now what I'm going to do is hit the mask button down here, and there we have it. And we should have a pretty reasonable mask as is. So if you do want to make some fine-tuning adjustments, you can double click in there and that will open up into your mask mode as well, and you can drop in an overlay or something like that to give you an idea of actually what you've got. And you can try things out like using the edge refine tool and see if that helps out and gets any more detail, and use a combination of the two as required, because remember, your image is not destroyed, it is merely hiding, so which is really cool. We've done a nice big zoom out there. Don't forget, you can play around with the shift edge as well, that could help, and even the feather might do some funky stuff, but for me, I usually don't use those a hell of a lot. I'm going to hit OK on that one. Just to do a check, I am going to create a new layer in the background, so I can really see what's going on, and fill that with a bucket so that I can get a really good idea of what's happening in the background here. Create a new layer above, just as I showed you before, and turn that into a clipping mask because I need to fix up some of this bleed through area here. B for brush, select the color, make sure you've got a nice soft brush for this, soft round brush, lower the opacity, and we can start actually painting in and getting a little bit closer to the hair color, particularly on the edge. Get that opacity down pretty low actually, so you can get it to blend a little bit more, and we can run through and hopefully fix that up a little bit more. I've gone a little bit over the edge on the shirt, but that's demo mode time. And finally, do run through the blend mode, see if you can find one that works. As I said, multiply will quite often work on darker hair, blends it in nicely. If it is leaking from green screen or something like that, color will usually fix that. Other than that, something around screen or overlay will sometimes work, or even just leave it at normal if it's a relatively low opacity. You can usually get that to happen there. And then once we drop in our new background, whatever that may be, we should be pretty good. So let's just drop in something like that, and that is pretty good. We've got a lot of the strands there. The more time you spend on it, the better you get at it, and the more detail you can get into these strands of hair. And use that dodge and burn, use the paint bucket, whatever's required on that, and make sure you get a good mask on your object, and away we go. Alright, we'll catch you on the next time.